Hi there, and welcome to this episode of Fantasy for the Ages, the show where father and son sit down and talk about some fantasy books. I'm the son of that equation, Zach.
And I'm the father, Jim, here with you again today for one of our to read or not to read episodes. Very exciting one for us to talk about today.
Yes.
And I'm not in my house again.
Yeah, you're still in that same other place.
Yeah, it's a time of year in my work cycle where, since there isn't a pandemic ravaging everywhere now, I travel. So some of these come to us from hotel rooms, and always trusting and praying the Wi-Fi is pretty decent. This is our second one today, and I think the first one mostly came off okay.
Notably, this is not Fantasy for the Ages saying that COVID doesn't exist, simply that it is not impacting the life of everyone to the same extent that it was previously.
Correct. We are learning to live with COVID, managing as we can. I am a duly following the science of things, fully vaccinated and boosted, and in fact looking at getting my next booster shot, which is available to me now. And kind of like I get a flu shot, I'll get a COVID shot and just try to keep it from ever becoming a big thing for me.
Speaking of, have you had your flu shot?
Not yet. I'll be getting that. Probably do the same. Do them both at the same time. I know others who have done that too.
Then probably for the first time, like ever, I had my flu shot before you.
Ha!
Granted,
well, how about that?
That was because at the end of a day of giving a bunch of flu shots, I was able to just be like, hey, you want to give me mine? And they were like, yeah. So,
although there haven't been that many years where you've gotten a flu shot to start
not too
with.
many. And that's just, I haven't. But I'm an adult now who makes his own choices and actually is responsible.
And works in healthcare, so you kind of got to model things
yeah,
too.
But most days I'm telling someone, yeah, you're flu A or B positive. Granted, I'm not the one telling them, but I'm finding it out. It's kind of useful to be vaccinated.
Okay, very good. We've got Amis with us here in Discord today. Hey, welcome.
Great to see you.
I think she may have some thoughts about Dragonlance. So that's cool. She's never read them. Oh, perfect.
We'll try not to spoil anything, but tell you whether you should or should not read Dragonlance.
And we will try to influence your thoughts. This is how we do it here. We certainly, I don't know. I don't think we've had any where we've flat out said, don't read this book. It's awful.
I don't know.
Literature is so subjective, you know?
I've definitely come close on some to be like, if you're this kind of person, don't read it.
Well, yeah. I mean, we'll give our thoughts along those lines for sure.
Anyway, I don't think we'd actually officially said, obviously, if you're listening, you've read what the title of this episode is about, but we are doing one of our to read or not to reads, and it is about Dragonlance.
Yes, and I'll get into the facts on that in just a moment, but we have not yet revealed what we're drinking yet, which is, of course, a tradition for this show. Zach, what are you drinking?
I'm just drinking the same thing I was in our last episode, which may come out before this one. I have a really hard time keeping track. Cool.
No, it will.
Because I had some Mountain Dew left over, so I was like, let's throw a little bit more SoCo, finish off the rest of my Mountain Dew. That way I'm not mixing my liquors. Are you drinking anything yet?
I am still not drinking anything.
Didn't even get some water?
I did have a drink of water between episodes, yes, but I don't have any with me now. It's just one more thing to spill on my laptop.
I mean, wait, one more thing. What did you already spill on your laptop?
Well, nothing now, but there was that time when a whole mocha got poured onto my laptop.
Okay.
That doesn't go well.
Small anecdotal thing. I was just sitting on the couch with my wonderful dog Rolly over here. And I was trying to just maneuver blankets so that it was on me. He could hop on. It was going to be great. And I was reminded again of the fact that I live with a wonderful woman who I love very much, but leaves glasses everywhere.
Oh, your mother does that too. It drives me nuts.
Most of the time ones that have about this much left in them.
Yes, finish it or dump it. Don't just leave it.
And I was reminded of it because I pulled the blanket up and the blanket smacked into a glass, knocked it off the table and onto the ground. Very small mess because there wasn't much there, but I was like,
I will say, thankfully, that when your mother does stuff like that, at least it's usually just water. You know, she's not going to leave little glasses of wine or, other juice. No, it's going to be water.
If I remember correctly, this glass was sitting there. It had just been ice left in the glass after she finished her drink.
There you go.
And we didn't do anything about the glass, so the ice melted and was just a little bit of water at the bottom.
Now, Amis says she's drinking a fairly boring seltzer. Now, boring seltzer is just, like carbonated water that you can add to things. I'm guessing hers has a little
tablet in,
I'm guessing hers has a little bit of alcohol in it because that's a seltzer that's popular these days. So that's not boring.
But, I mean, there's a lot of variety.
Yes,
we go in
hard seltzer,
White Claw. We go in more Bud Light sodas. Not bad. It's weird that I can say they're not bad. Bud Light is not good. No. Bud Light is not good. However, the Budweiser seltzer sodas, not bad in terms of seltzers because they don't taste too seltzery. Okay. The Topo Chico, those aren't bad.
I've never heard of Topo Chico. White Claw I've heard of, not Topo Chico.
They have a hard seltzer line. It's not bad. Again, to me, they land a little bit more on the seltzery side. So you do have to kind of be down for that. But if you're down for seltzer, go for it.
Now, I think we should probably move along then because I don't think seltzer, hard or soft, appears in Dragonlance at all.
Does it not?
No. I think we'll need to let that go. Definitely SoCo doesn't show up, by the way. Every once in a while, I mean, I keep some of that stocked and someone will make fun of me. Really? SoCo? Jim? Really?
Why not?
I like it. It's a guilty pleasure all the way back to college.
I don't think there's anything wrong with it.
Nah. All right. Well, Dragonlance. Mm-hmm. So this is really going back a ways for our to read or not to read episodes. And, we have varied like that. We've done some series that are a little more current. We've done some that are very classic. This one kind of falls into both because...
Kind of.
Yeah. Dragonlance, as a series, started all the way back in 1984, but it's still evolving. There's still content that comes out from time to time in the Dragonlance setting. So it's an ongoing living organism.
And I think it's really good that you said that. The Dragonlance setting, not the Dragonlance story.
Which I'm going to get to. I'm going to explain a little bit momentarily, but let me remind people, in case you're new to read or not to read, the basic ground rules of this episode is that we're going to talk about these books using our spoiler-lite format. So we'll give a general overview of the basics of what it's sort of about, but we're not going to reveal plot points. We're not going to ruin the story. So if you haven't read it before, nothing we say is going to ruin anything in the books for you. Mm-hmm. We may whet your interest if you haven't, and you'll have a better idea of whether it's worth your time to pick them up and give them a try. That's kind of it. Our opinions is what you're getting. So this is going to be highly subjective. This is not literary analysis. We're fans of literature and fantasy, and we're going to tell you what we think. We may not have the same opinion on these things because we are two very different individuals.
That's valid.
You're going to hear what we think. And we will, at the end, kind of give you some legit reasons, we think they're legit, of why you may or may not enjoy this series. That's what this is about.
Mm-hmm.
So we start off always with just the facts. Dragonlance is not strictly a book series. It's a whole fantasy universe initially created by Laura and Tracy Hickman, both of them are authors, as a setting for Dungeons and Dragons campaigns. And the books set in the Dragonlance universe give rich texture to this gaming landscape. The first D&D game module set in the Dragonlance universe was called Dragons of Despair, and it was a fully fleshed out campaign. So someone could be the dungeon master and just use this campaign, not have to prepare anything. It's all there for you, and take some campaigners through it.
Question of clarification: this world and this D&D campaign setting both existed pre-novels?
You just had to let me get to my next sentence, and I answer that question for you. Because the Dragonlance setting was rolled out with this Dragons of Despair at the same time as the first book of the Dragonlance Chronicles, which is the original trilogy. So they came out together, basically. I don't know if they came out the same date, but they came out the same year. And basically, the Hickmans had come up with this world as they were going to apply for a job with TSR, which was doing all the Dungeons and Dragons stuff. And it's like, here's our concept, and we're going to put this out here for you. And then it was like, and we could do more with this if we write novels that expand on this. And they could feed back and forth between each other. And that has gone on for years and years and years. Mm-hmm. So the original series then is called the Dragonlance Chronicles, a trilogy that Tracy Hickman of Tracy and Laura Hickman, Tracy Hickman wrote along with originally the editor, Margaret Weiss. Now, they were going to get a different author altogether to write this book, because Hickman came up, with the world, with this universe, Dragonlance, and Weiss was going to be the editor that they would have work with an author to create a novel.
So what happened?
Help popularize this. Well, the author just wasn't getting it. And Weiss and Hickman basically put their heads together and said, we could do better than this guy. So that guy was bounced, and they wrote the book.
And thus the beautiful partnership of these two was born, and they did this and a lot of other things.
They did. So they wrote this first book. It was big success. They were encouraged to continue. However, the first book was a little harder to write because they were kind of trying to shoehorn it to fit with the campaign, with the Dragons of Despair campaign. Mm-hmm. Whereas for the next two books, they said, no, we're going to write a book, and then you guys can create a campaign that kind of flows from what's the things that are introduced in the book. Mm-hmm. And that was a lot easier to do. So the initial trilogy establishes an event in the Dragonlance world called the War of the Lance, and tons of campaigning can spin off of the events that happen there.
It's some really rich material. Yeah.
Yes. So these first three books came out in less than a year. Like the first book came out in November of 1984, and the third book was October of 1985. So just bam, 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 you get Dragons of Autumn Twilight, followed by Dragons of Winter Night, and then Dragons of Spring Dawning. And they tell a complete story. And they introduce you to some great characters that also introduce you to a whole bunch of stuff that is Dungeons and Dragons. I'll get to that in a little bit. The thing is to understand with Dragonlance books, they were always intended to draw people into the games, into the role-playing game, and to get people excited about the kinds of things they could do playing Dungeons and Dragons. But they were so successful on their own that there are plenty of people who have read Dragonlance books and never played D&D.
Correct.
Because they're quality literature. They're telling great tales in this amazing setting. According to Wikipedia now, there's at least 190 novels that have been written in the Dragonlance setting. And they're not done. There's still... And
That's
this was not...
so many.
This was not all Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. Lots of other authors have been brought in or volunteered, to write books in Dragonlance. Now, Wizards of the West Coast, I believe, are the ones that currently own Dragonlance property.
I need to correct you.
Yeah?
Wizards of the Coast. It is not Wizards of the West Coast.
Wow, where did West creep in?
I
Did
have
it used to be?
no idea. Nope.
Man,
Pretty sure
I don't know
not.
where that came in.
But no, the current owners of D&D and various properties surrounding that is Wizards of the Coast.
Yeah, TSR ran into some financial trouble. Wizards of the Coast bought them out. And so anyone who's writing Dragonlance stuff has permission from Wizards of the Coast. And there's money involved in all that stuff. Weiss and Hickman have written multiple books in that setting, but again, there are far more that's involved. The best, my opinion, the best books of the series are the first 2 trilogies. And then you've got lots of other tales, and lots of people will like different stories of them. But the first 6 books are just classic. And it's the initial trilogy called, again, the Dragonlance Chronicles. And then you move into Dragonlance Legends, which is still related to the same group of characters that you saw in Dragonlance Chronicles. But focuses in much more on 2 characters who are brothers and their half-sister for the Dragonlance Legends part.
Mm-hmm.
So in the original trilogy, we meet Tanis Half-Elven, Tasselhoff Burrfoot, Flint Fireforge, Sturm Brightblade. I mean, great names and stuff. But we also meet Raistlin Magir and his twin brother, Karaman Magir. The 2 are nothing alike.
Nope.
Totally different. They are not identical twins. Okay, but they are twins.
Really?
Yeah. And then their half-sister, Kitiara Uthmatar. Okay.
Names.
Names. Man, come on. That's D&D, classic names. Everybody comes up with their characters and they roll for all their traits and stuff, and then they make up their name, and nobody says Bob.
I beg to differ.
Okay,
I
someone
run D&D literally every week. And when I have to come up with an NPC that ends up being a lovable NPC that was supposed to be there for only about 2 seconds and ends up being there for the whole campaign, their name is Ben. There's no last name. His name is Ben. And that's
Ben.
it.
All right. I'm trying to think. I think when it comes to just the facts, I think I've laid out enough of the facts of the series that I want to do. I did mention that the planet, I mean, we say the Dragonlance universe, but it's primarily focused on one planet called Kryn, but it features multiple ages of time. Even that second trilogy goes beyond just one period of time, because time traveling becomes part of the series.
I want to throw a small snippet in here to say we've talked about this being connected to D&D and all this, that this Dragonlance setting is with these novels and D&D. But for any people who maybe haven't read any Dragonlance, haven't done the stuff, but do know about D&D, some D&D lore, things like that, it's one of the less common modern settings. There are a number of very interesting settings. This one is still very active and usable, but it is not the immediate jump. It's not the Forgotten Realms, which is what is being featured in the upcoming Dungeons & Dragons mainstream movie, which is fantastic.
Forgotten Realms is probably the second most significant historically of the settings of Dungeons & Dragons. And it came around not all that long after Dragonlance did. Own set of novels following the same kind of format.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
it was loosely an alternative to Dragonlance.
Yeah. Let's do it again, basically. We created Dragonlance. Now let's create somewhere else. Yeah. Personal experiences with the series is what we move on to now. So I'll tell about mine first, and then Zach, tell about yours. So I read the Dragonlance Chronicles, that first trilogy, very early in my fantasy reading. Early 20s. I don't think I was still a teenager, but I might have been. So it's very possible it was more around 18, somewhere in that range. I'm pretty sure this is where it gets muddy for me. I'm pretty sure I was in college when I read them. But I started
which
college
is
when I was
questionable.
16,
Yeah.
and I finished when I was
Nerd.
20. So yeah, I was a little advanced. So Dragonlance was somewhere in there, but it might have been just after college. And I continued right away with Dragonlance Legends because this was great. I want more. And same characters. Oh, Raceland and Karaman are there. They were like my favorite characters in the original trilogy.
Really?
So it was great. Yes. Oh, I loved Raceland. And then Karaman because he's like right there with them and naive doofus, but there's deeper stuff there. And again, spoiler-lite, so we're not going to go too far into it. And then Kitiara, she's a whole nother thing. When I read this, I'd already played Dungeons and Dragons. I'd already been a dungeon master before I got to these books. I started playing D&D in junior high, so I had years behind me. I played it in junior high, I played it in high school, I still played it in college for a bit. These books felt very classic D&D for me when I found them, which makes sense because of how they came about. It featured humans, dwarves, elves, half-elves, kenders, dragons, and so many other things. But it also introduced in the books, made it logically laid out in these stories, other things that I knew all about from Dungeons and Dragons, like classes. So you've got characters who are these different races, but they could also be a fighter, a rogue, a wizard, a cleric, a paladin. Now, paladin is not used in these books, but there's totally paladins here. They just don't happen to use that term yet. It comes around later. Also introduces us to something else we knew from playing the game, alignments. Lawful good, chaotic good, neutral evil. Different characters are clearly laid out that way. So because I played Dungeons and Dragons, this was all very recognizable. It felt fun and good to get deep into a fantasy story in a setting that just I'd spent many happy years playing. Made a lot of sense. I've gone on to read numerous other Dragonlance books over the years, beyond those first 6, though nowhere close to 190 plus books. But nothing I've read has captured my imagination like those first 6 books. And honestly, I found the second trilogy more captivating than the first one. Not everybody may agree with me on that, but if you like the first trilogy, move on to the second one, move on to Legends. You'll probably like it at least as much, maybe more. Now, what's your experience with Dragonlance?
So I first read the first trilogy, similarly pretty early in fantasy. You had started me on D&D just briefly in like 3rd grade. I was like 8, 9, 10, somewhere in there. And it was shortly around that time, maybe a year later. I did read the first 3. I don't remember that like at all. I remember I did it. I don't remember them. I remember I enjoyed them. And it was like me trying to get this bit of D&D that I missed because we'd started and then we stopped and we didn't pick it up. We got busy. We did other things. But I remember it being something I enjoyed. So a year, 2 years ago, sometime not that long ago, in the grand scheme of things, this came back up in conversation. I was like, oh yeah, I remember those. Oh yeah, wait a second, because now I'm a lot more into D&D.
Right.
And was like, these are official books connected to actual realms. And like, we can go to the bookstore. Rach and I were in Barnes & Noble the other day, and she was right there with me in the fantasy section, looks there and goes, wait a second. These books, Dragonlance, it says Wizards of the Coast on there. Are these like real D&D novels? I was like, yeah, they're real. It's a thing. So I went back and I started reading them again. I only got through like the first of the first trilogy just because I had other things that came up that I really wanted to read. So that kind of stunted that. But it was also because I had a weird disconnect with this series as an adult.
Interesting.
Not because I was reading it as an adult, but because I was reading it as an adult who has gotten very into Dungeons and Dragons, especially 5th edition and beyond now, and the lore of other worlds, be it Forgotten Realms or Eberron or whatever. And so some of the things worked and others didn't. One of the things that often doesn't fit well with me is something like alignment, because it's very classic D&D, but it's also something that more recently, especially the last couple of years, official D&D content has moved away from and done away with, because like having a race be classically just evil across the board doesn't really make sense. But it is something classic in fantasy and classic in these worlds. So it still exists in these older Dragonlance books, but just from me as a steeped in the lore DM person, was like, ooh, I'm down with this, but it feels wrong for my D&D world now.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense, since I didn't play the more modern D&D stuff. Where I read these, this is where I lived. And I could understand the disconnect for you. Yeah,
well, makes a lot of sense. You even made the point of saying there are people that you recognize as paladins, but they don't get called paladins, at least not at first. And I'm pretty sure it's because in original D&D, there weren't paladins.
They hadn't come up with that yet. All right. Well, let's break down some of our strengths and weaknesses of the series then. And now we're staying away from Dragonlance as the Dungeons and Dragons setting, and we're focusing just on these books.
Just as a series.
So a general strength, I've got 5 that I throw together here, and then I'd like to see if you agree or disagree with any of these, or if you'd add other things.
Let's go with it.
Just the world itself is so interesting and cool. The settings that they're able to dive into and the experiences they have in these books is fun and compelling and dangerous and exciting. So that was great.
I will agree that there is a nice emphasis on world building without being too in the nitty-gritty of it, because it was intentionally making a point to be like, this needs to be a world that you can actually jump into. So it cares about making sure to explain the world.
Yeah, it's complex. It has a lot of nuance to it. Amis asks in Discord then, if you don't play D&D, would you have a different take on the world, the setting, the books at all? And I really don't think so. It's just well crafted still. I will stand by the fact that you don't have to be a Dungeons and Dragons player to enjoy these books.
It's very clear that the world building was paid attention to beyond just the narrative. And so it feels like an actually constructed world that a story takes place in, rather than a world that is simply existing for this singular narrative.
But again, there was the intention of they're setting this vast, cool world so they can make all sorts of campaigns that people will play Dungeons and Dragons in. So they had another agenda, but it still serves the purpose of making some really cool literature.
I think
another strength. Yes. Yeah, another strength is the characters themselves. They're very compelling, cool characters. Again, some I like more than others, but just lots of fun. I enjoyed the characters.
I will definitely say this is one of the more successful series in very quickly establishing who characters are. And it does a very good job of this person, this person, this person are all very different. But you like all of these different people for their differences. And it does it very quickly.
You see in Discord there, Skeeter thinks Tasselhoff Burfoot is the best. He's not alone in that. Tasselhoff is definitely a favorite of many who read these books. Just like Tanis is not. I mean, there's Tanis fans or Tanis stans, how they say that, but he was never my favorite. Nope. But Tasselhoff is cool. And just like I really like Raceland, but man, Raceland is not a very nice guy. He's very not likable, but
Yeah, the
I
fact
find
that
the
you liked
character
him that much,
compelling.
I was very confused by it, but I was willing to just leave it alone.
He's more complex than most of them are, and I
Yeah, but
like
if
complex
someone says that
characters.
that's your favorite character, I personally think that's a red flag. And we'll just move on.
All right, another strength of the series is the magic. Now, let's be clear. This is a soft magic system. The magic serves the story.
Which is kind of weird, knowing things about it. But you're right, it is.
Yeah. I mean, Dungeons and Dragons has magic with rules and laws and the way it works.
These
But
novels don't.
No, this does, but it doesn't bother to explain everything sometimes for the books. It just kind of lets things happen. I wouldn't say maybe I'm characterizing it poorly. It's not massively soft, but it's not super strong.
When we talk
hard.
in terms of hard versus soft magic systems, this sits a lot further closer to the Tolkien side.
Oh yes.
The intentional magic is magic, and we're not explaining how it works, just that it does, and it's very cool when it does.
There you go. Hey, Jordo's with us in Discord now too. Welcome, Jordo.
Great to see ya.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure he appreciated that you just dropped a Tolkien reference in there, because big Tolkien fan.
Mentioning that we don't dislike soft magic systems or Tolkien, because we've sometimes come across that way. We don't.
We don't. Okay. Another strength: dragons. There's dragons in the story. Everyone likes dragons. These are very traditional Dungeons and Dragons.
Now, I would also go very traditional, being Dungeons and Dragons, very traditional Western dragons.
Oh. Western
Just in
dragons.
terms of mythology, it's very much the Middle Ages.
Oh, yeah. Not Asian style,
not
Year of the Dragons.
Eastern.
No. Right. The last strength I'll toss out about the series, these books, is something we've already talked about in length. Just the way it really seems to bring the best qualities of nostalgic Dungeons and Dragons to life. Now, I'd be interesting to know, because that's all I can speak to. The more modern books, do they reflect the way D&D has also modernized? I'd be interested to know, because I haven't read any of those.
I haven't read those either. I am aware of some of them, both in the Dragonlance and in some of the other things, that give very interesting perspectives and dives into weird lore channels that serve as excellent sources and really interesting perspectives, but don't always necessarily follow like the game. And I think that's good for them as novels.
Okay.
I really do.
Okay. Any other strengths you would identify from your thoughts?
I mean, you hit the big ones that I wanted to talk about. The world and the characters. That was
there you go.
The biggest thing to me about these books.
Weaknesses. I only have 2, and they're not really big weaknesses. I like the books. I'm a fan. The ones I've read, I've enjoyed. The weaknesses mostly come, this first one comes from more my research, not my personal experience. And that's that the quality of the books varies greatly. Now, that's not really shocking when you got 190 some books. They're not going to be all epic stories.
Some series are great, but others were money grabs.
Yes. They keep buying them. Churn out more. There's some of that feel with some. Now, again, there's some quality authors, right, in some of these books. So there's some top-notch stories in here, but I don't believe they're all consistently excellent. That's how that is. Another weakness is the magic sometimes. So we already talked about that. It's not as well defined as it ought to be at times for the preference you may have about magic in fantasy stories. You might not be bothered by it at all, but some will find, I want Brandon Sanderson's magic back. You're not going to get that style in these books.
And that's okay, but if it's not your cup of tea, it would be a weakness.
That's right.
I have one that I want to toss out.
Good. Go
and
for
it could be contentious.
Ooh, Zach's attempted a hot take.
Admittedly think the plots are a little simplistic. That's not to say that they're really like dumb or dumbed down or anything. Not at all. But rather, this is not a series that catches me off guard with its turns, and I'm like shocked. I have to put the book down because I was like, oh my goodness. Anything that I've read from it is like, yeah, that makes sense. And I enjoyed reading it, but it wasn't surprising.
I cannot agree with you on that one. Different readers, but there were multiple circumstances in both the first two trilogies for sure where, oh no, I didn't see that coming. What? The mysteries and surprises abounded. So I had a different reading experience.
Different reading experiences.
Yeah. So again, we're all unique. We all see what we see in literature a little differently. All right, Zach, would you dive into Dragonlance books again? Ones you've already read or new ones? What do you think? Would you?
To some extent, yes. I would go back and continue rereading like I already was. Those early ones, maybe that second trilogy. And I think I'd be willing, with a little bit of research, to handpick certain series or novels that I want. I don't think I'm willing to read all 100 and however many. I got too many other things that are worth reading, and knowing that some of these aren't makes it rough.
All right, I probably won't read much Dragonlance again because I have the same problem you have. There's so many other things waiting to read that I want to read. At the same time, the nostalgia pull is strong. So I could see myself rereading those first 6 books like in a book club format. Again, just, hey, anybody want to do this with us? And jump into Dragonlance and experience that? Because it would just be warm and comfortable and fun. But there's a little part of me that goes, wow, there's like 184 more beyond those 6. That could be a ride. I think I might enjoy really moving through all these Dragonlance books, but that's too much a commitment.
That's a lot.
I do own some that I've never read. They're sitting on my shelf.
3 days, so who knows?
Yeah, the Dragonlance books are that kind of category where I have some just taking up space on a shelf that I should get to someday. Yeah.
I know one of our next questions here is, would you recommend these books? I don't know if that's the next question or if it's like one further down, but it does kind of segue. You mentioned you might go back and reread those first few. And that's where, would I recommend these books? I'd recommend the first few. The first trilogy, maybe the second. If someone likes it, they can read more. But that first trilogy goes on the list of foundational fantasy that I think everyone who enjoys fantasy should read at some point. It does actually make my list. Yes, I recommend, but not all 190.
Okay, works for me. I would concur with that. If somebody out there, if you're listening to this and you have not read the original Dragonlance Chronicles, that first trilogy, you have a gap that honestly I would urge you to fill.
Yeah.
We haven't said that very strongly about many things that we've covered in this series, but the to read or not to read. But I would say that about this first trilogy. Yep.
And I'll even say, you may read it and it will not be the best fantasy that you've ever read. It will not be your favorite fantasy you've ever read. I do think it's still necessary that you read it.
It adds some color and flavor that you ought to experience. Yes.
It's historical fantasy context, if anything.
There you go. Rating scale, 1 to 100. We do this with every series we cover. How we subjectively feel this series rates in comparison to all the other fantasy fiction we've personally read. Where do you put this? Your experience with Dragonlance.
Yeah, can I have 2 ratings? Can I have the rating for what I know I've read and all 190?
Okay, sure.
What I know I've read, I'm going to give it a solid like 62. It does not hit the
62.
yeah, it doesn't hit the like amazing quality, but it's definitely above my middle ground. It's in the category where I'm glad I read it. It's worth reading. I'll go back and read it again. Maybe it'll get higher. But it's not in my top 10 fantasy I've ever read kind of thing.
Okay.
The full 190, it's probably way lower. It's probably like 38 because I know there are some that I have not read that I know are just hokey and bad.
Possibly. I'm more optimistic than you. I gave one rating number for the whole thing based on, because I've read more than the first 6, based on the ones I've read, and then my faith and trust that there'd be enough in the rest to give it some value. So I rate Dragonlance as a whole as a 65.
Okay.
It's not tops, no, but it's not the bottom half either. It's solidly up there where it's going to be entertaining. It's quality. I enjoyed it. I would enjoy it again.
It's worth a read. It's definitely enjoyable, but am I going to be talking for the rest of my life always about, oh, it's the best books ever? No, that's not going to happen.
Right. Okay, our final question then is, what sort of person do we think may enjoy this series? That goes to the kind of person we would recommend this to.
Any fantasy lover.
Okay, all right. I put specifically classic fantasy fans.
That's fair.
So not just any. I mean, if you like grimdark, this is not your thing. This is not grimdark fantasy. But if you're into the epic high fantasy classic stuff, this is going to feel really good.
I also throw in, whether it's more modern or past, if you somehow, and I say somehow, I know people like this, enjoy playing D&D but are not a big reader, not a huge reader of fantasy, try this. Because it will have enough fun similarity to the races, to the classes, to alignments, to these various things that are enjoyable and recognizable, that it might get you into fantasy reading and world building and things like that.
Your gateway. I had in my notes, any Dungeons and Dragons gamer. They would probably enjoy the series. Even if the version they know is very different, there's enough of the feel and similarity there that they're going to recognize things. They're going to enjoy what's going on. And yeah, wow, it could be their gateway into all sorts of fantasy. That's kind of cool.
The last category that I would put is really kind of where I sat with it. A younger exploratory reader. Someone who's trying out different genres and trying to figure out what do they really enjoy, maybe in, say, their middle school years. This is a pretty good softball fantasy. Like, it's not, at least initially, hitting you over the head too much with anything too abrasive or rough.
True. Yeah.
That
it's not that everything's roses and unicorns, but you're right. It's not.
And in the same way that we were just saying with Dungeons and Dragons players, it's decent gateway.
Yeah. Very nice. All right, that's what we got. That's where we're at for today. We've covered the series. I hope people enjoy it. I hope we've inspired you, if you've not touched Dragonlance at all, to go find that first series. Find the Chronicles. Pick it up. Check it out. See what you think. I think you'll enjoy the ride.
Absolutely.
I'm going to run the outro then, because that's where we're at. Discord, thank you for being with us today. It's always fun. We have people along for the ride when we do these recordings. If you're listening out there and wonder why are some people with them in the background on Discord, it's because they're Patreon supporters. And when I run the outro, you'll see that. You have an opportunity to join us for any of our live recordings if you support us on Patreon. As little as $1 a month. We're cheap. Okay, we just love having people with us. So let me run this now.
Yes, we'll run our intro. We'll eventually get to the point where we say bye and all that. I'll run off and start running D&D in a little bit because I do that.
That's right. Very appropriate.
Very topical.
So, yeah, you're seeing on the screen again the reminder of the same things in our show notes, the ways to connect with us, support us, be a part of us, and even find us on Discord. By the way, Zach, I did notice your new shirt. You didn't say anything about it, but you just saw that musical last night.
Great show last night. Great music, great show. Very enjoyable, and I got some merch.
Hades Town gets 2 thumbs up from Zach. There you go.
Absolutely.
And I finally just heard about it, so. All right. Talk to you next time.